They silenced my report on the ration tin trap. It stopped 12 tanks anyway. On March 23, 1951, at approximately 4:17 in the morning, I watched 12 Chinese Type 97 medium tanks roll directly over what my commanding officer had called garbage improvisation from a farm boy who doesn't understand real warfare. And in the next 90 seconds, those 12 tanks transformed from an unstoppable armored spearhead into burning wrecks scattered across a Korean valley. And the report I had submitted 3 days earlier, describing exactly how to build the trap that destroyed, then was sitting in a file cabinet marked Rejected Field Modifications in some rear echelon headquarters, where officers who had never seen combat made decisions about what enlisted men were allowed to do to stay alive. And that right there tells you everything you need to know about how this story ends. Or rather how it doesn't end, because officially this never happened. Officially those 12 tanks were destroyed by conventional anti-tank weapons that we didn't have. Officially my report was never written, and the improvised minefield constructed from C-ration tins and black powder scraped from artillery shells was never deployed. And officially, I'm just an old man living in another country now, telling stories that the United States Army would prefer stayed buried. My name is Sergeant Dean, though that's not the name I was born with. Names have been changed in these stories for reasons of security and discretion, but the events I'm about to describe happened exactly as I tell them, and the 12 Chinese tanks that got destroyed were real, and the men who would have died if those tanks had broken through our lines were real, and the officers who buried my report because it made them look foolish were real too, though I won't name them because some of them are probably still alive, and I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in truth. I'm interested in making sure that the lessons we learned in Blood and Fire don't get lost, because they were inconvenient for the people writing the official histories. Let me go back to March 20th, 1951, 3 days before those tanks rolled into my trap, back to when I was a 26-year-old sergeant serving with an undermanned rifle company somewhere in Central Korea during what they were calling a police action, but what felt a whole lot like a war, when Chinese artillery was dropping on your position and you were eating one meal a day and wondering if you'd live to see tomorrow. We had been holding a defensive position in a valley for about 2 weeks. Style. Endowed defensive setup with fighting positions dug into the hillsides overlooking a narrow valley floor that was the only practical route for vehicles or large troop movements. And our orders were to hold that position and prevent Chinese forces from using the valley to advance south towards Seoul. And we were doing okay with that mission, despite being chronically short on everything from ammunition to medical supplies. But then our company commander, Captain Morrison, received intelligence report that the Chinese were massing armor in our sector, specifically Type 97 medium tanks that they had either captured from the Japanese or received from the Soviets. And Morrison called a meeting of all the NCOs and told us that we needed to prepare anti-tank defenses because there was a real possibility we'd face an armored assault within the next few days. Now here's where it gets interesting, or maybe I should say here's where it gets stupid, depending on your perspective, because when Morrison asked what anti-tank capabilities we had, the answer was basically nothing. We had no bazookas because they'd been allocated to other units that were deemed higher priority. We had no anti-tank mines because the supply convoy carrying them had been ambushed 2 weeks earlier. We had no recoilless rifles because those were being held in reserve for what head? Quarters called critical defensive positions, which apparently didn't include our valley, and we had no air support or artillery support pre-registered on our position because the Air Force and artillery batteries were overwhelmed with requests, and we were considered a low probability target for enemy armor, so basically we were expected to hold a position against possible tank attack with nothing but rifles, machine guns, and hope. And when I pointed this out to Captain Morrison, he said, Understand the situation, Sergeant Dean, but we work with what we have, not what we wish we had. I've submitted requests for anti-tank weapons through proper channels and will receive them when they become available. And I said, sir, with respect, by the time they become available through proper channels, we might all be dead. And Morrison didn't like that comment, but he also couldn't argue with it because he knew I was right. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those Chinese tanks and about what would happen if they came down that valley and we had no way to stop them. They would roll right through our positions, destroy our fighting holes with cannon fire, crush our men under their treads, and there wouldn't be a damn thing we could do about it except die. And I'd been in enough combat by that point in my life to know that I didn't want to die because of bureaucratic failures and supply chain problems. And I wanted to die fighting, if I had to die at all. And so I started thinking about improvisation, about what resources we actually had available and how they might be used in ways that the field manuals never anticipated. And this is where my background becomes relevant. I grew up on a farm in rural America during the Depression. We were poor. We didn't have money to buy proper tools or equipment when things broke. So you learned to fix things with whatever materials you had on hand. You learned to improvise solutions to problems using scrap metal and wire and creativity. And that practical knowledge of improvisation was something the Army never taught, because the Army assumed you'd always have the proper equipment, and if you didn't, you'd just wait until it arrived through proper channels. Around 2 a.m. on March 21st, I got out of my sleeping bag and went to look at our supply dump, which sounds more impressive than it was because our supply dump consisted of about a dozen wooden crates containing C-rations, ammunition, medical supplies, and miscellaneous equipment, and I started taking inventory of what we actually had versus what we might be able to use. And this is when I noticed something interesting about our C-ration tins. We had cases and cases of them because food was one T. The supply system actually managed to deliver consistently, and these tins were made of tin-plated steel. They were roughly cylindrical, about 4 inches tall and 3 inches in diameter, and they had a flat bottom and a sealed top. And I picked one up and looked at it and thought about how it was basically a ready-made container about the right size to hold an explosive charge. And then I started thinking about what explosive materials we had available and how you might construct an improvised anti-tank mine using materials that were already in our supply dump. We had artillery shells. We had boxes of 105mm high explosive rounds that were supposed to be used for indirect fire support, but that we couldn't actually use because we had no artillery pieces at our position. They'd been left with us by mistake when an artillery battery had displaced 2 weeks earlier, and I knew from my training that those shells contained a high explosive filling plus a fuse assembly, and I also knew that with the right tools and knowledge you could carefully disassemble an artillery shell and extract the explosive filling. And I also knew that this was incredibly dangerous and definitely not authorized by any field manual or safety regulation, but I also knew that black powder explosive extracted from artillery shells could theoretically be repacked into smaller containers like C-ration tins to create improvised explosive devices. And yes, I understand that what I'm describing sounds insane and reckless, and under normal circumstances it would be insane and reckless. Yes, but these weren't normal circumstances. These were circumstances where we might face 12 tanks with no anti-tank weapons, and our choices were either to improvise something or to die. Let me pause here for a second. I need some water. Talking about this still gets my heart racing after all these years. Okay, I'm back. So on the morning of March 21st, I approached Captain Morrison and I told him I had an idea for creating improvised anti-tank mines using C-ration tins and explosive material from artillery shells. And Morrison's first reaction was exactly what you'd expect. He said, "Sergeant Dean, are you out of your mind? You want to disassemble live artillery shells and repack explosives into tin cans. That's insanely dangerous and completely unauthorized. And I said, yes, sir, it's both of those things, but it's also our only option for stopping tanks if they come down this valley. And Morrison said, even if I was willing to authorize something that dangerous, which I'm not, how would you even detonate these improvised mines? You can't just put explosives in a tin can and hope they go off when a tank runs over them. And this is where I explained the second part of my plan, which involved using pressure-sensitive detonators that we could improvise from grenade fuses. And Morrison listened to all of this. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, Sergeant Dean, I appreciate creative thinking, but what you're describing is not a legitimate military tactic. It's a jury-rigged disaster waiting to happen. You're talking about violating multiple safety regulations, creating unauthorized explosive devices, and deploying them in a manner that's not covered. By any approved doctrine, I can't authorize that. And if you proceed without authorization, I'll have you court-martialed. Is that clear? And I said, yes, sir, that's clear. But what I was thinking was that Morrison was more concerned about following regulations than about the fact that we had no way to stop enemy tanks. That afternoon, I was supposed to be running a patrol, but instead, I gathered 3 men from my squad, guys I trusted and who had the technical skills I needed. There was Private James Kowalski, who had been an auto mechanic before the war and understood how mechanical systems worked. There was Corporal William Rodriguez, who had worked in a munitions factory and actually had some experience with explosives. And there was Private Chen, who had been an engineering student and could do the math to re-out how much explosive charge we'd need and how to configure the detonators. And I explained to these 3 men what I wanted to do. And I was very clear that this was not authorized, that if we got caught, we'd probably face court-martial, and that if we made a mistake during the assembly process, we'd probably blow ourselves up. And I gave them the chance to back out, and none of them did. Rodriguez said, Sergeant, if Chinese tanks come through here, we're dead anyway, so we might as well try something even if it's crazy. And Kowalski said, I've been improvising solutions to mechanical problems my whole life. This is just improvisation with higher stakes. And Chen said, the mathematics are actually sound. If we're careful about the assembly, this should work. And that was it. We had our team. Over the next 2 days, March 21st and 22nd, working mostly at night when we wouldn't be observed, we constructed what I later called the Ration Tin Minefield. Though it never got an official designation because officially it never existed, the process was this. First, Rodriguez would very carefully disassemble a 105mm artillery shell using improvised tools. He'd remove the fuse assembly and then carefully extract the explosive filling, which was a yellowish powder. And this was terrifying work, because one mistake could detonate the shell and kill everyone within 50 yards. But Rodriguez had steady hands and good knowledge of how these things were constructed. Second, Kowalski would take C-ration tins and modify them by drilling small holes for the detonator assembly and creating a pressure plate on top, using the tin lid and some spring mechanisms he improvised from radio parts. Third, Chen would calculate the exact amount of explosive needed for each mine, based on the armor thickness of Type 97 tanks, which he estimated from intelligence reports and Japanese tank specifications, and he determined that approximately 400 grams of explosive per mine would be sufficient to damage tank tracks or potentially penetrate belly armor if the mine went off directly underneath the vehicle. And fourth, I would oversee the final assembly, which involved packing the explosive into the prepared C-ration tin, installing the pressure-sensitive detonator, which we made by modifying hand grenade fuses, and sealing the whole thing with wax to keep moisture out. We worked in a hidden position, about 200 yards from the main company area. We told everyone we were on patrol or doing equipment maintenance. And over those 2 days, we managed to produce 18 functional ration tin mines. each one about the size of a C-ration can, which is to say small enough to be easily concealed, but large enough to contain a charge that could damage a tank. And when we were done, I had this moment of looking at these 18 improvised mines lined up in a row and thinking about what they represented. They represented violations of probably a dozen different army regulations. They represented hundreds of hours of Depression-era farm boy ingenuity applied to modern warfare. They represented the gap between what headquarters thought we needed and what we actually needed to survive. And they represented the fact that sometimes you have to break the rules to stay alive. And I knew that if I deployed these mines without authorization, I'd be risking court-martials. But I also knew that if Chinese tanks came and I hadn't deployed them, I'd be risking the lives of every man in our company, and that wasn't a difficult choice for me to make. On the evening of March 22nd, I wrote a detailed report describing the ration tin mines, who they were constructed, what materials were used, how they should be deployed, and what their expected effectiveness would be against Type 97 tanks, and I submitted this report to Captain Morrison through proper channels, and Morrison read it, and I watched his face go through several expressions. First, surprise that I had actually built these things despite his explicit order not to, then anger that I had disobeyed him, then what looked like grudging respect for the technical sophistication of what we'd accomplished, and then finally a kind of bureaucratic fear which I recognized as the expression of an officer who realizes he's in a situation where there's no good option. If he approved my report, he'd be endorsing unauthorized explosive devices and violations of safety regulations. But if he rejected my report and Chinese tanks came through and killed his men, he'd have to explain why he had rejected a defensive measure that might have saved lives, and Morrison chose what he probably thought was the middle path. He said, "Sergeant Dean, I'm not going to approve this report because I can't officially endorse what you've done, but I'm also not going to court-martial you because I understand your intentions were to protect the company. So here's what's going to happen. You will not deploy these devices. You will safely dispose of them by disarming them and scattering the components. And you will never mention this to anyone, and in return I will forget that this conversation ever happened, and we'll all move on. Is that acceptable?" And I said, "No, sir, that's not acceptable." And Morrison said, "Excuse me." And I said, "Sir, with respect, if Chinese tanks come through this valley and we have no way to stop them, men will die, and I will not dispose of these mines when they represent our only chance of survival." There was a long silence after I said that, and I could see Morrison calculating his options. He could order me arrested for insubordination. He could confiscate the mines and have them destroyed. He could write me up for court-martial. But all of those actions would take time and would create a paper trail and would require him to explain to his superiors why he was punishing a sergeant for trying to create anti-tank defenses when no anti-tank defenses had been provided through proper channels. And Morrison was smart enough to realize that this situation could make him look very bad if it was examined too closely. So he took my report and he stamped it "Rejected Unauthorized Field Modification," and he filed it away. And he said, "Sergeant Dean, you will not deploy these devices. That's an order. If you disobey this order, there will be consequences. Dismissed." And I saluted and left his tent and went directly to the valley floor, where I spent the next 3 hours with Kowalski, Rodriguez and Chen, deploying all 18 ration tin mines in a pattern designed to create a kill zone for armored vehicles. We buried the mines at specific points along the valley floor where we calculated tanks would have to travel based on the terrain. We placed them in 2 staggered rows about 30 yards apart. We covered them with dirt and scattered leaves and debris to make them invisible, and we marked their locations on a map so we'd know where they were and could avoid them during our own patrols. and when we were done, we had created an improvised minefield that covered about 200 yards of valley flee. And that minefield represented 18 chances to stop Chinese tanks, 18 possible saves for the lives of American soldiers, 18 violations of direct orders from Captain Morrison, and one sergeant's decision that staying alive was more important than following rules that would get people killed. And I want to be very clear about something here. I'm not proud of disobeying a direct order. I'm not recommending that soldiers routinely ignore their officers. Military discipline exists for good reasons, and most of the time you should follow orders even when you don't agree with them. But sometimes, very rarely, you find yourself in a situation where following orders will result in unnecessary deaths, and your conscience won't let you do it. And this was one of those situations. March 23rd, 1951, started quietly. We were all exhausted from the night work of deploying the mines. I hadn't told anyone except my three-man team that the mines were in place because I didn't want word getting back to Morrison, and I spent most of the morning in my fighting position, watching the valley and wondering if I'd made the right decision, or if I'd just created a disaster that would get me court-martialed and accomplish nothing. And then, at approximately 3:45 p.m., we started receiving reports from our observation posts that Chinese forces were massing to the north, large formations of infantry with vehicle support. And at 4:02 p.m., our forward observer reported visual contact with Chinese armor. He counted at least 12 tanks moving south, down the valley directly toward our position. And Captain Morrison came on the radio net and started issuing orders for all positions to prepare for armored assault. And I could hear in his voice that he was scared because he knew what we all knew, which was that we had no effective anti-tank weapons, and if those 12 tanks reached our lines, they would destroy us. At 4:17 a.m., that's when it happened. I was in my fighting position on the hillside, overlooking the valley with a pair of binoculars, and I watched the first Chinese Type 97 tank enter the kill zone where we had deployed the ration tin mines. The tank was moving at maybe 10 miles per hour, standard assault speed, with infantry following behind, using the tank as cover, and the tank rolled directly over the position where I knew we had buried the first mine. And for a moment, nothing happened, and I thought, oh God, the detonator failed, or the explosive was damp, or we miscalculated something. But then there was a flash and a loud explosion, and the tank lurched to a halt. Its right track had been blown off by the mine, and before the Chinese tank crew could react, a second tank behind it rolled over another mine position, and that mine detonated too, taking off that tank's left track. And then there was a moment of confusion in the Chinese formation, as the tank commanders realized they were in a minefield, and some of them tried to reverse, and some of them tried to push forward, and in their panic they drove over more mine positions, and over the next 90 seconds I watched as explosion after explosion rippled through the Chinese armor column. Some mines caught tanks directly underneath their thinnest armor, and the explosions penetrated into the crew compartments. Other mines hit tracks and immobilized the vehicles, and when the smoke cleared, 12 Chinese Type 97 tanks were either burning or immobilized in that valley, and the infantry that had been following them had scattered into the tree line, and our company had just survived what should have been a devastating armored assault without firing a single anti-tank round because we didn't have any anti-tank rounds to fire. The silence after those explosions was profound. Everyone in our company was staring down at the valley floor, trying to process what had just happened, and Captain Morrison came running to my position, and he looked at the burning tanks, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Sergeant Dean, did you deploy those mines after I explicitly ordered you not to?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I did." And Morrison said, "You disobeyed a direct order." And I said, "Yes, sir, I did. And if I hadn't disobeyed that order, those 12 tanks would have overrun our position, and most of the men in this company would be dead right now." And Morrison stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating he could court-martial me for insubordination and disobeying orders. But if he did that, he would have to explain why he had rejected a defensive measure that had just saved his entire company. He would have to admit that his decision to prohibit the mines had been wrong. He would have to acknowledge that a sergeant had better tactical judgment than he did, and none of those things would be good for his career. So Morrison made a decision that probably saved his career but buried the truth. He said, "Sergeant Dean, here is what's going to happen. The official after-action report will state that Chinese armor was destroyed by conventional landmines that were early deployed according to established doctrine. There will be no mention of improvised explosives or unauthorized field modifications. There will be no mention of your report or my rejection of it. This incident will be classified in a way that makes it unavailable for historical review, and you will never speak about what really happened here. If you agree to this, we'll forget about the insubordination charge, and you can continue serving. If you don't agree to this, I'll have you arrested and court-martialed, and you'll spend the next 5 years in a military prison. What's it going to be, Sergeant?" I thought about this for maybe 10 seconds. I thought about truth and justice and the historical record. I thought about wanting credit for saving those men's lives. I thought about wanting the army to learn from what we'd done so other units could use the same techniques. But then I thought about spending 5 years in prison while men like Morrison got promoted and wrote the official histories, and I made a pragmatic decision. I said, "Yes, sir, I agree to those terms," and Morrison said, "Good, Oh, help me figure out how to explain away the fact that we supposedly had conventional landmines when our supply records show we had none. And that's how the cover-up began. Morrison falsified supply records to show that we had received a shipment of anti-tank mines that never actually arrived. He filed an after-action report that attributed the destruction of 12 Chinese tanks to properly deployed conventional defensive mines. He classified the entire incident at a level that made it inaccessible to anyone who might ask questions. And he buried my original report so deep in the filing system that it would never be found. And in exchange, I got to avoid prison and continue serving and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But here's the thing about buried truths. They don't stay buried forever. They eat at you. They keep you awake at night. They make you wonder about all the other soldiers in all the other wars who improvised solutions that saved lives, but never got credit because the solutions didn't fit approved doctrine. And they make you angry at a system that's more concerned with protecting the careers of mediocre officers than with learning from the successes of creative sergeants. And after carrying this story for decades, I decided that I don't care anymore about the consequences. I'm old. I'm living in another country. The people involved are mostly dead or too old to prosecute. And the truth deserves to be told, even if telling it makes the army look bad. And here's the truth. On March 23, 1951, 18 improvised mines constructed from C-ration tins and artillery shell explosives destroyed or disabled 12 Chinese Type 97 tanks and saved the lives of approximately 140 American soldiers who would have been killed if those tanks had broken through our defensive line. And the technique we used could have been taught to other units and could have saved more lives in other engagements. But it wasn't taught because teaching it would have required admitting that approved doctrine was inadequate and that enlisted men sometimes know more about survival than officers with college degrees. I kept copies of everything. I kept my original report describing the ration tin mines. I kept Rodriguez's technical notes on explosives handling. I kept Chen's calculations on charge weights and detonator configurations. I kept the map showing where we deployed the mines. And I kept all of this hidden for decades, waiting for a time when I could tell the story without risking prosecution. And that time is now, and if the U.S. Army wants to court-martial an 80-year-old man living in another country for telling the truth about something that happened 70 years ago, then they're welcome to try. But I don't think they will, because prosecuting me would just draw more attention to a story they'd prefer stayed buried. And that's fine with me, because the point isn't to embarrass anyone. The point is to preserve a lesson that was learned in blood and fear and desperation. The lesson that sometimes improvisation saves lie. Lives when doctrine fails. Sometimes farm boys know things that West Point graduates don't. And sometimes the most important military innovations come from sergeants with dirty hands rather than from generals with clean desks. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you answer. Would you have deployed those mines after Morrison ordered you not to? Would you have risked court-martial and prison to do what you thought was right, even when your commanding officer explicitly forbid it? And before you answer, consider that you'd be betting your freedom and your career on your own judgment against official authority. You'd be taking responsibility for any mistakes or accidents that might result from your improvisation. You'd be putting yourself in a position where, if things went wrong, you'd have no one to blame but yourself. But also consider that if you didn't deploy those mines and Chinese tanks came through and killed your friends, you'd have to live with that for the rest of your life, knowing that you could have prevented it, but you chose to follow orders instead. And that's not a theoretical question for me. That's a decision I actually had to make, and I chose to deploy to. He mines and disobey the order, and I'd make the same choice again, knowing what I know now, because those 140 men who survived deserve to live more than I deserve to avoid conflict with authority. And if you think I'm wrong about that, then you've never been in a position where lives depended on your decisions, and the approved methods weren't adequate to the situation. The 18 ration tin mines that we built and deployed in March 1951 represented about 40 hours of work spread across 4 men. They cost nothing in terms of official resources because we used materials that were already in our supply dump. They required no specialized training beyond what we learned from our civilian backgrounds, and they were more effective than any conventional anti-tank mine we could have received through proper channels because we designed them specifically for the terrain and threat we were facing. And that's the real lesson here. The lesson that bureaucratic military systems have trouble accepting, which is that sometimes the best solutions come from the bottom up rather than the top down. Sometimes enlisted men who grew up poor and learned to improvise have insights that officers who grew up comfortable and learned to follow procedures don't have. And sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules that were written by people who never experienced the situation those rules were supposed to address. And if the military could learn to embrace that kind of adaptive innovation instead of punishing it, we'd be a more effective fighting force. But institutions don't like to learn lessons that threaten their hierarchies and their credos and their approved ways of doing things. So instead they bury the reports and classify the incidents and court-martial the sergeants who were right. Captain Morrison, I should tell you what happened to him after this incident. He got promoted. He eventually made major. He served out his career and retired with a pension. And as far as I know, he never told anyone the truth about what happened in that valley in March 1951. He took the credit for the successful defense against Chinese armor. He never mentioned that the mines weren't conventional mines, or that he had explicitly rejected the defensive measure that saved his company, and I don't entirely blame him for that, because the system rewards officers who make themselves look good and punishes officers who admit mistakes. But I also don't respect him, because a real leader would have admitted that his sergeant had better judgment than he did, and would have made sure that lesson was preserved for other units to learn from. But Morrison wasn't that kind of leader. He was the kind of leader who protects his career first and his men second, and the army has a lot of leaders like that. More than it should, because the promotion system rewards political skill and bureaucratic compliance more than it rewards tactical innovation and moral courage. I'm getting tired now. These stories take a lot out of me even after all these years. But I want to finish this properly because I think the ending matters. After the war, after I left the service, I tried several times to get the story of the ration tin mines officially recognized. I wrote letters to military historians. I submitted documentation to the Army's historical archive. I tried to get reporters interested in the story, and every time I got the same response, either no response at all, or a polite letter saying that the incident I described couldn't be verified through official records and therefore couldn't be included in historical accounts. And the reason it couldn't be verified was because Morrison had deliberately buried all the records. He had classified them and misfiled them and destroyed them to protect his own career, and that's how history gets written. Not by what actually happened, but by what got officially documented. And if the official documentation is false or incomplete or deliberately misleading, then the history that gets written is false too. And that's why I'm telling these stories now, because I have the original documents that Morrison tried to bury. I have the proof that what I'm telling you really happened, and I'm making sure that proof gets preserved somewhere, that historians can eventually find it, even if it takes another 50 years. To the men who served with me that day, to Kowalski and Rodriguez and Chen, who helped build those mines, and who never got any credit for saving 140 lives, if you're still out there, if you're watching this, I want you to know that I remember your skill and your courage and your willingness to break the rules, when breaking the rules was the right thing to do. And I want you to know that what we did mattered. It mattered more than any medal or commendation could ever mar. Because we saved lives, we kept our friends alive, and that's worth more than all the official recognition in the world. And if you have your own stories about times when you improvised solutions that saved lives but never got credit, I hope you'll tell those stories too, because these buried files need to be unearthed, these hidden truths need to be told, and the lessons we learned in combat need to be preserved, even if they're uncomfortable for the institutions that claim to represent us. So that's the story of how 18 C-ration tin mines destroyed 12 Chinese tanks, and how the report describing them got silenced and buried. That's the story of how one sergeant's disobedience saved a company, and how his reward was to be threatened with court-martial and forced into silence. And that's the story of how the official histories lie not by what they say, but by what they leave out. And if this story makes you angry or makes you question what else might be hidden in those classifieds, files, good. You should be angry, you should question, because the truth is usually more complicated and more interesting than the official version. And the people who actually did the work and took the risks deserve to have their stories told, even if those stories make the authorities uncomfortable. So share this if you think it deserves to be heard. Subscribe if you want more buried files to be unearthed, and leave a comment telling me whether you would have disobeyed that order, whether you would have deployed those mines knowing you could go to prison for it, because I genuinely want to know if people still understand that sometimes the right thing to do is the unauthorized thing. Sometimes survival requires breaking the rules, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones they tried to silence.